Great. Our next speaker is Lauren Stewart. Lauren created the Mind, Music and Brain course at Goldsmith University. She spent her career in neuroscience researching there, and she's going to tell us a bit about what happens to sound when the brain gets hold of it. Lauren.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to just say a few words about the act of listening, and my specialty is thinking about how we deal with musical sound in particular. I think the first point I'd like to convince you of is that listening to music and complex sound like speech and environmental sounds is an extremely active process, and it requires the brain to solve many, many problems when you actually have to interpret sound. So if you think about what sound is, it's really a collection of air molecules vibrating at our eardrums. Yet we infer so much more about the sound from this rather noisy signal at our ear. So if you think about what happens if you just listen to a single melody played by a single piece of by a single instrument, your brain has to convert the frequency of vibrations into pitch and the intensity of those vibrations into something to do with loudness. So already that's an extremely complex process, and it's carried out by a number of sort of stations within the brain. So taking sound, obviously a lot of processing going on in the inner ear, and then more complex as you ascend into the brain itself and these different stations. But if you think about what we're normally dealing with, we normally have a very complex soundscape that we have to make sense of. And really all we've got is this complex mix of air vibrations that we're able to somehow disentangle and resolve to sort of say, well, I can hear the click of the camera here, I can hear somebody talking over there, and I can sort of easily stream this information. And I think the fact that we can do this so effortlessly makes us think to some extent that listening is a very passive process, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It requires a lot of active processing on behalf of the brain. And something that I think many people don't appreciate is that although there's a traffic going upwards to the brain from the ear, there's actually a lot more traffic coming in the opposite direction in terms of connections that descend from the brain to the inner ear. And it's these pathways that are extremely important in allowing us to attend to different aspects of the soundscape. Yeah? So we can essentially selectively attend to very salient parts of the stimulus as it's coming in. So I think the reason that we appreciate listening to music so much and have such an affinity for it is because we like to seek patterns. The brain likes to create order from chaos, and music is quite a super stimulus for doing this because it's got many orders of complexity. And we find it very pleasurable when we're able to actually find a pattern out of this rather complex stimulus. And the second thing I'd want to add, so basically so far I've told you that listening is extremely complex, and we find it feels very effortless to us, but there's a number of very tricky problems that the brain's solving when it's listening. The second thing I want to go on to say is that we can really tune up our brains in many different ways to be expert with different aspects of a sound. So one very sort of specialist example of this comes from a paper that I recently published about piano tuners who have got an extremely specialist skill that they need thousands of hours of practice in order to listen out for what's called beats that occur when you play two tones together and the harmonics in those two tones don't quite coincide, and it sets up this pattern of pulsations, if you like. So it sounds like the volume is getting louder and softer. Not only can they detect these, but they're very sensitive to the rate at which they occur. And that's the basis of piano tuning. It's extremely complex, and we found that actually piano tuners' brains had changed in a very particular area called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is very important in memory, and it's the area that was found to be changed in the famous study of London taxi drivers, who are obviously very adept at navigating a spatial environment. And we argue that what piano tuners are adept at doing is navigating a complex soundscape. Obviously, the features that they're looking out for when they're doing this are very different to the ones in visual space that the taxi drivers use. But nevertheless, it's this idea that the soundscape has these properties that can be used to kind of navigate when you're trying to interpret sound in this active listening way. And a more sort of typical example of how our experience shapes what we can infer from a sound concerns the example of culture. And it's a very interesting set of experiments for some collaborators in Canada. And they showed that basically Canadian-born infants are born with the ability to perceive rhythms both in their native music of their native system. So Western rhythms are very regular, but they're also very adept at making sense of Balkan rhythms, which are very irregular. Now, interestingly, so you can basically find out a lot about what babies are perceiving by using a very special kind of head turn procedure, which I won't go into, but suffice to say we know a lot about what babies are perceiving, even though they can't tell us about it. What they found was that after 6 months of age, the infant stopped being able to hear little deviations in the non-native rhythms. So they started to become expert in the kind of music that they were being exposed to. Whereas older infants, and certainly adults, were absolutely useless at hearing this deviation in the non-native rhythms. So it's just like language. We're born into the world with the ability to hear very subtle speech sounds, like the difference between R and L, which we can do, but Japanese people can't. And the reason that is because we start off with this sort of blank slate, but the more we're exposed to our environments, the more we get our perception is shaped. And so really we are sensitive to lots of things in our musical world and our sound world according to how much we have come across them in our past. So your history with perceiving sound affects how you interpret future sound and subsequent sound. So this idea of sort of your personal listening history can be very important in shaping your perceptual abilities. Finally, the last thing I want to say is that you might think that there's a fairly consistent relationship between the perception of sound and the emotional experience that we have to sound. So for instance, you might think that the better you perceive something, the more you're likely to be able to appreciate it and have an emotional response to it. But we know from neuroscience that that's actually not necessarily the case, and that the brain deals with the perception of sound rather differently to its appreciation of sound. So one example of that is a man who suffered a stroke. He was a radio presenter, and he was in the habit of going home after one of his shifts and relaxing to Rachmaninoff. And he used to experience a shiver down the spine when he heard this particular passage of Rachmaninoff. Unfortunately, he suffered a stroke that affected specific parts of his brain. And after the stroke, although he was able to perceive music just as accurately as before, he no longer had this intense emotional experience to it. Conversely, we can think about people who have impoverished hearing, so for instance, people who lose their hearing and are fitted with cochlear implants. The signal that's arriving at their eardrum and then subsequently being processed by the brain is very degraded compared to the information that we all experience. But nevertheless, through a process of exposing themselves to sound environment, they can learn to actually find structure and find meaning and appreciate sound, despite it being a rather sort of noisy and very impoverished signal. So what you feel about music and sound in general is not necessarily coupled closely to how accurately you perceive it. Those two things can be uncoupled. And just finally, I would say, in touching on what the lessons might be for people who are thinking about designing sound, I would say that it very much depends on the purpose to which sound is going to be put. But I would say that a few factors to bear in mind would be our basic physiology, so what are our sensory systems designed to cope with. Obviously, you know, there's certain parameters that we can deal with and others that we can't, and certain features of our physiology that make certain sounds pleasing. Many psychological factors to do with our attentional limits and memory capacities that are probably common to all of us. But then also I'd urge people to consider very much the personal and the specific. So your personal listening histories can very much shape how you respond to a particular sound environment. And also the context in which you're listening has an enormous part to play as well. That's all for now. Thank you.